addressing the UN General Assembly last year, Iranian President Hassan Rouhani put forth his wave proposal to fight extremism and violence in all its forms. A year on, and the world is grappling with more extremism and terrorism than before. As the international community scrambles to coordinate a collective response to the rising threat of extremism and terrorism, President Rouhani stressed on the significance of understanding the root causes of terrorism and the aims for which it came about. In this edition of the debate, we take a deeper look at the strategy being presented by Iran and the comments made by President Rouhani on Thursday at the UN General Assembly in this regard.
Iran's President Hassan Rouhani addressing the 69th UN General Assembly annual meeting. Rouhani dedicated a great deal of his speech to the issue of terrorism and the notorious terrorist groups operating in the Middle East like the ISIL and al-Qaeda. Rouhani demanded an apology from those countries which he said made the strategic blunder of creating the terrorist groups with certain aims.
All those who played a role in the creation of these terrorist groups must admit their mistake to give rise to extremism. The strategic blunders of the West in the Middle East and Central Asia and the Caucasus have turned the region into a haven for terrorists and extremists.
Rouhani said terrorist groups like al-Qaeda and the ISIL were created to give rise to Islamophobia worldwide and to pave the way for military expedition by extra-regional countries to the Middle East. Rouhani further criticized the Western media for trying to portray the terrorist groups as Islamic. Rouhani's comments come in the midst of air and missile attacks by the US and its regional Arab allies, which allegedly are against the ISIL terrorists in Syria. In a quirk of politics, Saudi Arabia and Qatar, which have been funding and arming the militants in Syria, are among those participating in the airstrikes against the Arab nation. The Pentagon says Arab jets and US warplanes have jointly carried out strikes in Syria. Saudi Arabia and Qatar have so far spent hundreds of millions of dollars to support the anti-Damascus insurgents. They have sent many shipments of weapons to the militants, with having ended up in the hands of the ISIL. The same governments also stand accused of destabilizing Syria's neighbor Iraq, where the Takfiri militants of the ISIL have been committing atrocities against civilians on a large scale since June. Iraqi officials have repeatedly slammed Saudi Arabia for organizing terrorist cells in Iraq. All this have caused pessimism as to the attacks on Syria and Iraq, which are said to be aimed at toppling the government in Damascus and disintegrating Iraq.
The war on terror, this thing on ISIS is just another phony war on terror, because it's an offshoot of the terror campaign that we launched against Syria. And they thought it was a great idea to take all these unemployed, out-of-work men with no marriage prospects and use them for cannon fodder, inexpensive cannon fodder for regime change, because they knew the American people wouldn't support American troops doing it anymore.
Well, let's start off by introducing our guest for this edition of the debate. From London is a political commentator, Sukant Chandan. And joining us from Washington is the former U.S. Assistant Secretary of Defense, Lawrence J. Korb. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us this hour. Let me begin with you, Mr. Chandan. Now, President Rouhani said earlier today at the UN General Assembly that the experience of the creation of al-Qaeda, the Taliban, and modern extremist groups have demonstrated that one cannot use extremist groups to counter an opposing state and remain impervious to the consequences of rising extremism. This basically defines Western intervention in many Muslim countries and even in Ukraine. What's your response to it?
I would agree with the comments by President Rouhani, except for the fact that I don't think that the death squads that the West and their regional allies have unleashed against Libya, Syria, Iraq, and other regions and countries actually adversely strategically affects the West at all, on any way that you can see this phenomenon. Actually, in every way you can see this phenomenon, these death squads benefit the West strategically on all accounts. Now, I want to cut to the chase, because what's happening now with the bombing of Syria from the Mediterranean and the North Persian Gulf is basically a trap for the Syrian government. And the trap is this. For the West, if they do not hear the Syrian government bending over backwards to support the Western bombing campaign of Syria, this is the same leading forces which have been financing, arming, and training the death squads against the Syrian government. If the West don't hear the Syrian government come to the support of their enemies in the West, then the West will, and already are, saying, look, the Syrian government is not supporting our war on terror in Syria. Therefore, the Syrian government and President Assad is part of the problem, and we must overthrow by means of a war of aggression the Syrian government. And they will want to do, whether they can do it is another thing, because Russia and China and Iran and Lebanese Hezbollah, along with the Syrian government, have their own say in this whole situation. But if they do, they will do to Syria what they've done to Libya, which is blitz it and bring to power the death squads and create Syria into a total defunct and collapsed state like they have delivered to Libya and before to Afghanistan, Somalia, Iraq, and which they are rolling out in other countries of the global south. That, and that alone, is the trap, the political strategy employed at the moment against Syria. Well, Mr. Korb knows very well indeed that the primary strategic allies of Washington, Paris and London governments are no other than the financiers and the armament suppliers of the same Khorasan and ISIL, etc. that he's mentioning. The primary strategic partners of London and Washington are no other than the Gulf monarchies, the Turkish state and the Pakistani military intelligence setup. That is the foundation of all these death squads. So if the West were interested in really fighting this scourge of terrorism, which is traumatizing and terribly impacting the people of the region that it is, they would cut this primary strategic relationship in this phony war on terror. But they are not interested in that. They are indeed interested in developing these death squads as a primary strategic tool in achieving their strategic interest. Mr. Korb talks about the Arab sting, and he is right in so far as that people of the region, like all people of the region, including the people of the United States, want change for the better. But Mr. Korb also knows that the Arab sting was the historic opportunity for the West to intervene, as it did by means of a 6-month bombing campaign in Libya by NATO, to achieve its strategic interest by openly partnering up with those who it told us for the last decade were the existentialist enemies of Western democracy and the other watchwords of neo-colonialism. I.e., in Libya and in Syria, we have an open alliance between the death squads broadly called al-Qaeda factions, be it the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, Jabhat al-Nusra, the moderate rebels as a false label whatsoever. So we have an open alliance. And then covertly, we've seen that is Western military intelligence boots are on the ground in Libya as they were from February 2011, as they are in Iraq and Syria, which are directing and manipulating and facilitating all of this. We've had hundreds of young people go to conduct terrorism from Britain via Turkey. Turkey has facilitated up to 12,000 people who have gone into Syria to conduct armed opposition to overthrow a sovereign country of the global south. So Mr. Korb's words are nothing but an attempt at creating mass confusion and befuddlement amongst the people who actually should be opposing this whole phony game.
Well, I'd like to pick up on a point that Mr. Korb made there, Mr. Chandan, is that of Obama highlighting that it's the future of Islam which is at stake here. And President Rouhani has spoken of how anti-terrorism and the war against terrorism as led by the U.S. has taken the form of Islamophobia around the world.
Yes, quite. But just to want to just reference the comment about Libya and the no-fly zone. Of course, the resolution which led to the no-fly zone was supposed to be an arms embargo on all factions and all sides in Libya. It wasn't. The British and the French particularly. And again, there's a grain of truth in what Mr. Korb is saying. It was definitely led by Paris and London. And Washington was kind of obliged to do a lot of the military legwork in Libya. And there was open disputes between these three countries at the time. But of course, the resolution at the United Nations was totally violated by NATO. There wasn't a no-fly zone. There was a fly zone just for NATO, though. And there was the arming of people. And that was the death squads and the rebels on the anti-Jamahiriya side. So anyway, that aside, again, this is the perpetuation of these lies and these historical untruths. But anyway, that aside. And I go back to the point, if the US administration is concerned about Muslims and Islam, let's not laugh, but if they are concerned about that, then why not cut the ties for the people who have the same conceptualization as ISIS in using and abusing this actually beautiful faith? Why not cut the connections with the Gulf monarchies then? Because what the Gulf monarchies represent in their interpretation or misinterpretation of Islam is exactly the same as the death squads that Mr. Korb pretends to oppose. So that's a very obvious point. There's another point that's not really in most of the analysis taking place. There's actually a historical development that's taken place in the last few days. That is, China and Iran are conducting for the first time a joint military naval exercise in the Persian Gulf just as we speak. That's taking place. So again, a part of this whole scenario is the West in response to that joint naval exercise to say, well, we are using the Persian Gulf as well to bomb one of your primary strategic allies in the region, and this is a response to your joint naval exercise, and this is a warning that this war of aggression can still come to you, Iran, and your allies. So that also has to be factored into the jigsaw which makes up the whole picture.
Chandan, your closing comments, please. Is the military option the only option to fight terrorism, and has the U.S. deployed any other options on the ground where it claims to be fighting terrorism?
Well, again, in response to Mr. Korb on the issue of al-Shabaab, why don't you cut ties with Riyadh, who are the mainstays of al-Shabaab, and everyone knows that. Of course, this is just falsehood, and this is just a counterinsurgency covert strategy to deliver Western strategic aims. The Syrian government has said the exactly correct thing. They have said that if the intention of the West is to fight these death squads, they would welcome it. But they know that they doubt that that's very much the case, because the Syrian government knows that this is another step up of gear to do to Syria what the NATO and the leading Western powers have done to Libya. And so really what we can see is a continuation of this strategy, and this is the main thing that they will use to try and bring along enough of the public opinion as possible to then justify this regime change attempt against the Syrian government. But however, the Syrian government is allied to Iran, Russia and China, and the growing strategic capacity of the global south. For the first time actually on Syria last year, I can't remember the last time when the countries of the region sabotaged a war of military, open war of military aggression against one of the countries in the region, and that was sabotaged by Lebanese Hezbollah, by the Iranian Revolutionary Guards, by the Syrian Arab Army, and also the Russian Navy of the Mediterranean. That sabotaged that, and that's what we will like to see again, to sabotage what's about to come. And the good news is the joint Iranian-Chinese naval exercise. We need more of that. We need a Southern Atlantic Treaty Organization to meet the North Atlantic Treaty Organization.
Okay. Let's leave it there. Time's gotten the better of us. That was political commentator Sukant Chandan joining us from London.